thanks very much to all three of you. I have just written down about 1,000 questions here that I would like to ask, and I'm sure you all have your own. So we'll try to have a little conversation up here for about a half an hour, and then hopefully some of you can get up and ask your own questions. The first question I had was about the nature of our perception of income inequality right now, and particularly the concentration of wealth in the top 1%, which your numbers bear out, and also the public perception of that. I'm wondering if we can have a little bit of an overview of why we feel right now the wealth is concentrating at that high tier. I noticed particularly you had that slide showing the great drop-off in the post-war years and how it's slowly trending upwards. Why do we see that trend happening?
Well, there's an interesting technology on. There's an interesting shift that's been gone on since that peak in the early portion. You're looking at total income at that graph, but that total income was by and large capital income. There were the big hunks of it were coming from investment. The current surge is interesting in that large amounts of it are related to wages, so the CEO wages, as you're seeing. So the wage remunerations are driving the recent curve. But it's hard to get a picture of it because what you're reading in the press are the top 100 CEOs. So even when I carve this number down to the top 0.01%, I'm still talking 2,500 Canadians. Right. And when you're looking at the paper, you see 100 CEOs that are growing by 50%, 100%. So it may look attenuated to some degree, but it's really the wages and salaries. The capital's not coming. But you have to be careful because the capital is what's causing some of that turnaround in the Great Recession. Some of the capital's dropping in there. So I guess one of the big differences, to answer your question, is it's more coming in the in the form of high wages than capital. Okay. And we didn't have a war to knock down the thing in the 40s. So it was
well, thank goodness for that. Yeah. I wanted to ask a question of you. I found it quite interesting where you were pointing out the differences in perception, particularly amongst age groups and also amongst regions. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what kind of challenges that would raise to kind of forming policy when you have certain groups that have a drastically different perception than others. I think the age thing might have always been with us to a certain extent, but I found the regionalism quite fascinating.
Maybe I'll make a comment that ties in as well with Brian. I mean, one of the things that comes out of Sheila. One of the inferences that comes out of Sheila's comment about inclusive public policies. So, in other words, largely universalized welfare state policies having an impact on reducing income inequalities, right? They're sort of those are often missed when you focus on targeted programs. That they actually have had a huge impact in the post-war period, and for sort of standard sort of political science sort of findings for a generation now is that those policies are also surprisingly resilient. Right. So in the attempts to sort of dismantle the welfare state that sort of has occurred in all sorts of countries since the early 1980s, those policies have been quite resilient. But on the other hand, we've also in the last 25 to 30 years seen almost no new universal programs. Ontario is an exception around the attempt to introduce a universal full-day kindergarten. Right? It's an anomaly on the policy landscape and deeply controversial, and lots of people saying, why don't you target it? If the benefits are disproportionately of full-day kindergarten go to disadvantaged families, why don't we restrict it, as some of the other provinces that do have full-day kindergarten have done. Right? But universal full-day kindergarten, from a popularity perspective, is actually immensely popular and actually makes, in all likelihood, full-day kindergarten more resilient. Right? But it's going to have some impacts on reducing income inequalities. Again, crudely put, because it has knock-on other effects on savings, for example, around childcare, enables labor market entry for households at the bottom. These more complex calculations, but you can see how it's an inclusive policy. But it's an exception. And again, the other example that was mounted, but of course was dismantled immediately, was a universal childcare policy at the federal level, right. Which had a very short life. And so there is a sense in which those policies and the disappearance of them is, or the fact they haven't continued to expand, hasn't been sort of expanding circle, which I think is how lots of people perceived what happened in the sort of arguably from universal hospital insurance in 56 right. to sort of the late 70s. That hasn't happened, and that's affected perceptions about who's benefiting. And again, I would also note that in the sort of policy space, post-2008, Canada didn't do a whole lot of innovation. Other countries did. Again, in my view, it's not a coincidence that Obamacare, in effect, the most significant achievement by the United States to cleave universal hospital or health insurance, occurred in a stimulus environment where they were able to dump money into a policy that was otherwise completely untenable and arguably unimaginable, say in 2006. Right. But all of the evidence suggests that those policies, particularly if you can use the type of graph that Sheila's pointed out, help to address income inequality, will actually affect some perceptions. And maybe in Canada, in fact, they haven't. Right. Hasn't.
Do we have any? Can you think of any? Am I still on? Can you give us some specific examples of other countries or regions that have continued to develop universal programs and how the perception of income inequality differs than ours?
I think the running example right now for World Cup people is Brazil. Right. Brazil is the poster child of doing innovative universal policies that are actually dramatically addressing income inequalities. Right. Obviously not enough, and of course they're balancing massive spending on world events like FIFA. But from a policy, it is an interesting example. But I mean, it just in Canada more domestically, you think about things like full-day kindergarten. It's arguable now that after this election, it's permanently on the policy landscape, and you'll see some pressure for it to happen elsewhere in the same way that there has been, I think, arguably some knock-on effects of the $7 daycare or childcare system in Quebec having some impact on policy elsewhere in the country.
And Sheila, I wanted to ask you, particularly because it came up again as a perception thing, and it was something you kind of mentioned briefly in your presentation. I'm intrigued by the constraints of globalization. Every day, when I'm covering things, we're looking at new trade agreements, or we're covering the incredible mobility of capital amongst large digital companies and whatnot. I wonder if you can expand a little bit more on the challenges of increased globalization in terms of creating policy.
I think that increased mobility has been sort of what Ontario has been living through over the past at least 10 to 12 years in terms of what's happened to the manufacturing sector. So I think that's very much that kind of lived experience in terms of the shift of manufacturing and the shift of kinds of industries that we had not thought could move. For example, some of these service industries that we thought couldn't move. But I think it's also really important to remember in terms of the low-income issues, that largely those are non-traded sectors, right? and to not confuse the pressures on traded sectors, which are also kind of often more high value added sectors, and so can bear more pressures than on the non-traded. And just an obvious example of a non-traded sector is your local pizza place, right? So there's no way that pizza making and delivery is going to be offshored, and therefore the kinds of policies that might improve working conditions for people who are working at that local pizza place really aren't going to be subject to those internationally competitive pressures. I think the biggest piece where those pressures come up is around tax policies, right? And let me clarify, it's not around corporate tax policy, where I think that's been absolutely oversold, because all those ideas about investment location and all that information says that there's a huge number of issues around investment location. And so part of it is, can you get your goods or your people in and out, which requires investment in public transit? Do you have an educated workforce? Do you have a reliable system, energy system? Do you have all of those other things? And then somewhere in there is the tax cost. But really, that's only one of the costs that corporations are facing. But I do think in terms of how incomes are moved around, both in the corporate tax system and in the personal income tax system, that's a really big constraint. And that's why I think we really can't only rely on taxes that other people pay to pay for our public services. It really has to be taxes that all of us pay.
Right.
Pete.
I wanted to, you have to forgive me, this is just kind of something that came up while the three of you were talking, and it's probably a half-formed question, but I'm interested in I guess what we would call the middle. We've focused a lot on high income and how an incredible amount of income is now going to the top 1%. We've focused a lot on low-income people who struggle to make a living wage, but a lot of voters, a lot of people who have to get behind public policy, and having, when I was on the city desk, helped cover the Occupy movement, a lot of the people who are actually actively involved are more middle class. I'm wondering what kind of information we have on specifically middle class perceptions of income inequality, and why the middle class might be feeling this, even if perhaps they're not the ones who are being directly economically affected either on the high end or the low end.
Well, you used the perception word, so we did that.
I'd be interested to hear what all three of you had to say.
Actually, I'll talk. I can talk, but specifically other work that I'm doing on big part of my research areas around access to civil justice. So how ordinary people use the civil justice system broadly conceived to resolve their legal problems. And what we know is that the justice system is just sort of a little pyramid, and the problems that get into the formal justice system are just a teeny tip, typically 5-7% of legal problems. So we've just done a national survey on legal problems in everyday life, suggested about 50% of Canadians have a serious civil legal problem every 3 years, which works out to about 7 million problems nationally. And just a teeny fraction of those ever gets close to the justice system. There's lots of evidence to suggest that most of those problems are concentrated in the middle class, and they're not receiving support from the publicly funded civil justice system. Lots of them solve these problems in different ways, but in the justice system, there is an immense amount of frustration about, for example, the high cost. Talking to somebody yesterday, was giving me an example of just trying to set up a power of attorney for his father, and saying it was actually incomprehensible that he got a legal bill for $8,700. It was just like, wow, that's just, and saying, these are problems that that seem to be collective problems that in the past they perceived the civil justice system was providing better support. And so that's an example where things come to the forefront, or frustration about post-secondary education costs. Again, there's all this evidence to show that, in fact, post-secondary education costs are cheaper now than they were 20 to 25 years ago, if you pull together all the various pieces. But among perceptions of middle-class families, there's a perception it's far more expensive than it was a generation ago. And those perceptions are causing a lot of anxiety and a lot of frustration.
What do you think is driving those perceptions? I understand in the legal system, but I'm intrigued both by the post-secondary and the economy at large, where.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's entirely separate from the labor job.
Right.
I mean, I know when I was as an undergraduate, it was relatively easy to get the equivalent of $20 an hour, $25 an hour summer job.
Right.
And now those jobs just don't exist. You know, if you've got kids, they're getting $12, $14 an hour jobs. They're making far less money.
Right.
And so more of the burden is falling on parents. We know that things like OSAP has become increasingly targeted, right? So, you know, the OSAP funding works that after $7,300, there's grant, but most middle-class families don't hit that $7,300 qualification, so they're just paying straightforward loans, or they see their kids taking loans. Whereas before, if you recall, say in the 80s, OSAP worked as a sort of matching dollar loan grant system. And so there are those kind of policy changes that are targeted, but likewise are contributing to some of that anxiety. Right. A lot of it is that people often will find that in certain things like post-secondary education now dread it, but actually it's not as bad as they feared before they were in the system. But we also had, you know, again, a government policy that exaggerated the cost of post-secondary education in order to pressure middle-class families to buy RESPs. Right? Think about all those numbers, those ridiculous numbers about the cost of sending your kids to school. And, you know, you looked at those and think, oh, my God, I got to start saving. But that contribute to the anxiety. You understand why public policy might have been trying to encourage people to invest in RESPs, but did contribute to anxiety.
Right. I know that anxiety.
Yeah. You know, I mean, but perceptions are perceptions, right? I mean, they're not, they're complex, and again, to come back to things like inclusive policies, rightly or wrongly, middle-class voters support policies that are inclusive. They like universal health care as opposed to targeted health care, even though it might make more sense to have targeted programs.
Right.
I find one of the more interesting perceptions when you talk of perceptions of the middle class is how everyone perceives themselves to be middle class. So we're looking at numbers in the 90% range, that kind of thing, and then we're saying we're middle class. So when we're focusing a talk here, I always have a hard time knowing who am I talking about. From my measurement perspective, we got a bunch of metrics we can use. We can use the middle three quintiles. We can use the middle quintile. I've seen that used. We can use from 75 to 150% of the median, some kind of median-based measure. But even there, we're talking about maybe 50%. If you're seeing a disappearing middle class, which you're not really, but it's gone from about 52 down to 48, which is its historical range of zooming in and out. So the middle class disappearing that you saw in the States Rust Belt, that's really not part of the story here. But the perception to me is fascinating that it's everyone, and so at its best, it's a very heterogeneous group. So designing policies in your middle class, you're up and down and flip around.
Well, it was funny. We had a discussion in the newsroom when we were talking about the middle class and trying to define it, and we found it was like, you know, nailing Jell-O to a wall. A middle class, like many other things, was what you wanted it to be. But this gets back to the regionalism a little bit. I'm from a very small town in southwestern Ontario of about 3,000 people, and what a middle class person is there compared to somebody who lives in East York, just south of Leaside in Toronto, what a middle class person in Toronto is drastically different in terms of what income is. And I mean, a lot of it goes to the expense of living in the city versus living in the country. But I guess maybe that might present some of its own challenges, that when you wanted to design a universal policy to address either low income or middle class or upper income concerns, depending on where you live, that's a drastically different thing. What was sorry, I had something else I wanted to ask here. We might open up the floor to questions in about 10 minutes. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I apologize. Oh, sorry, I wanted to ask, and this kind of got down to the regionalism as well, and because I'm at the Toronto Star, when you noted that a lot of the upper income growth is particularly in Toronto, Calgary too, but I'll just pretend they're not there. Is there anything at a municipal level that can be done to address some of these concerns? I know municipal politics doesn't get into taxation nearly so much, although we've tried in Toronto a little bit. Is there anything that can be done, local policy, to help alleviate some of these issues? I noticed, for instance, Sheila, you mentioned transit. That might be something that we could expand on a bit.
So I think there is room for local governments to do that. I mean, obviously there's less taxing power, but I think one of the things that you can think about is there is expanded taxing power under the City of Toronto Act, right? So that the provincial government realized and acknowledged that the City of Toronto was not the equivalent of the town in southwestern Ontario that you grew up in. So in terms of using both the property tax base and using business taxes and using some of those expanded tools to actually deliver the kinds of programs that we know can have an impact either through their universal impact or through a more targeted program is obviously an area. I think the thing that we have to also be aware of is the role of the public sector as an employer and as a purchaser. And so that there's been some really interesting work done at the city level around job quality index, and that's both in terms of the fairly large amount of purchasing that the City of Toronto does, and what are one of those conditions of contract compliance, and what other things do you look at? You look at quality, you look at price, but you also have a set of criteria that are required to ensure that you're buying those services from employers who are actually working against income inequality as opposed to increasing it.
I'm fascinated by that notion. I don't think it's unfair for me to say we kind of have a municipal government, at least in Toronto right now, that's very much focused on reducing costs and balancing the books. I have to assume that things of that nature are going to cost a little bit more because you're going to be paying staff more, or if you're going to be sourcing things locally, it potentially could cost more than just putting out a request for proposals and getting the lowest offer back. How have some municipal governments had success in pushing forward some of those proposals in contexts where there's a kind of a laser-like focus on balancing the books?
I know that other municipalities, I know that municipalities in Canada, I think Surrey has implemented a living wage policy. So that's not a fair wage policy, that's actually a kind of higher level of requirement. I know that in a bunch of places in the U.S., when they say that they've been implemented a higher minimum wage, and I thought always their kind of constitutional division of powers different, and it's not in fact. It is where you, in terms of sort of city contracting, you can do that kind of a change. And I think there are a couple of things that you need to think about. You can think about other costs, so that if, in fact, you have a fair wage policy, what's the impact going to be on your social assistance costs? You can think about the longer-term costs in terms of the impact on health, but that doesn't sort of meet a political cycle. So I think you're right that if you have a government that is solely focused on, you know, the immediate bottom line cost of something, you're not gonna have a lot of success. And really, what you have to do is you have to broaden that conversation to say, what is the value of the public services we have? So we've kind of lost the equation. Everybody knows about the taxes they pay, and somehow there's been this kind of perception, I think, from the current administration that you pay taxes and then it goes to the gravy train. And in fact, it doesn't go to the gravy train. It goes to the recreation program that you take your kids to, or that you're lined up and you can't get into. It goes to the transit, or how long you're waiting in line to get on the streetcar to go to work. So I think there's a broader conversation that needs to happen that links those taxes to those services to be able to change our approach to that kind of spending.
Some of the education services too, or the education ties to them, I've seen and heard in Toronto, the after school programs.
Right.
And that, not just providing food and childcare, I guess that's a side, but it's more the education, and they sit down and do the homework, and the high values of education are instilled in there, and that's the kind of education program that you'd need ultimately to help address some of the inequality long-term.
Right.
Also to the, in Toronto specifically, the idea of having, I can't, what's the current term now, for certain targeted neighborhoods.
Priority
neighborhoods.
No, they're not.
Priority.
They're no longer priority.
But you understand, that's another example of a policy which might seem specific to neighborhoods, but in effect, really indirectly, it's about addressing income inequalities within the city. Again, it's not well thought out in, I think, any of our studies, but part of the irony about Toronto is that if income inequality is an issue nationally, in Toronto, it's obviously the gaps are even wider.
Right.
And so it's not a surprise that it's going to come to the forefront.
I had to say, when you were talking about the gravy train notion, I did find that quite interesting in the last provincial election, that when there was the talk about cutting public service, there seemed to be there was a feeling about that was reflected in the vote in terms of it seemed as though a large percentage of the electorate was saying, okay, well, I think we've perhaps cut enough here, right? Do you guys have anything else you'd like to add? Anything you think we've missed, or should we open up the floor to let these people ask more intelligent questions than I have?
I could throw out one table that I didn't throw up. We did ask people about what they thought levels of government could do.
Right.
And so when we asked about the federal government, we had close to 60% saying that the federal government could do a lot.
Right.
And in fact, you had 30% could do some. And when we asked them actually about what their perception about what the federal government is actually doing, only 5% said they're doing a lot. So there's for sure a perception that the federal government is not doing much.
Right. That's fascinating.
And likewise, when we asked about provincial government, about 50% said that they could do a lot. And again, just around 5% said that they were doing a lot. So there's a strong perception that governments could do a lot more. We didn't ask about municipal governments,
right.
Although we do have a survey, I think, in the works that's going to talk about some of that stuff. There is for sure a strong perception that governments could do a lot more than what they're actually doing, which again kind of fits with Sheila's general point that there is a general perception that policy makes a difference. And again, we're not drilling down about taxes, regulation, so on, but there is a perception that governments make a difference.
Something to do. Great. Well, I'm going to open the floor to questions now.
Is this on? I think it is. My name is Arnold Gallett, and I'm with the Ontario Parole Board. I know these matters are complex, and I certainly got an appreciation for that in our discussion today. But perceptions aside, and I don't know who to ask this question of, quite frankly, but what proportionally what number of people proportionally fall into what we would call poverty and or working poor? And then secondly, how does that compare with Nordic countries in Europe, which are generally seen to be much more progressive than us? So some comment on that would be helpful from my perspective. Thank you.
Okay, I could start given my earlier comments that there's a million different low-income lines. I would say if I had to characterize it on average, around 12%. We're drifting at around the 12% low-income line of Canadians. It's up and down by region and everywhere, and that would be the overall low-income rate for after-tax income. Working poor is even less well-defined. There's a couple studies out of HRSDC and other studies that use, maybe 920 hours as a limit of working. There's other studies that use receiving at least $3,000 a year of income from working. And so, but given those distributions, you get a much smaller number. My ballpark number is 5-6%, somewhere in there on the working poor numbers. So I can give about 12 on that. We've typically been internationally closer to the States, which means closer to the high end of inequality. So while we're more in the middle of the pack in income inequality when it comes to low income or poverty, if you will, we're closer to the low end with the States.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for your comments and the insights you provided. My name is Sas Ansari. I'm from Osgoode Hall Law School. My research focuses on taxation, especially on the international level. But I just wanted to ask you guys a question about, because everyone seems to have mentioned perceptions needing to change or social views needing to change, media views needing to change. And one difficulty that I'm running into is one of the social views that my research bumps into constantly is the perception of the right to earned income or market distributions of income, how that's linked to justification of private property, and how those need to shift in order to actually have a shift in redistributive mechanisms. And I don't know quite how to address it, and how you can tell somebody what the market gives you is not really what you deserve. Sometimes it's much less, and sometimes it's much more. And the government really needs to step up and adjust what the market gives you, because that's a completely different thing than dealing with creating wealth in the market. What are your views on how that can be approached, or if that's even foreseeable? Because I think that's the biggest challenge that at least I see and I've run into. Thank you.
So it's probably less a question of policy as of changing perception, right?
Yeah. How could you see it being done? Because the public perception needs to shift, the media perception needs to shift. How do you address those unquestioned assumptions that our society is kind of built on, the free market society is built on, and the whole idea of individualism and private property is built on?
Well, if I could, from a numbers perspective, for starters, this is a new perception. We didn't see these numbers. As I alluded to briefly with SLID, that was the top 20%. And that was pretty new, because we didn't used to measure income distributions at all. So I see a really interesting evolution of the perception of that as we look in more and more detail, higher and higher up the income distribution. So in many ways, we get our first little glimpse of the top 1 or top 0.01 or the very, very high end from this tax data from SAES and VIL from other places. And our perception is to kind of generalize that down the scale a bit. It's like my point on the top 100. It's our ability to be able to see this top end, and now just today we've got a new view of the top end by linking corporate with that. This is a big evolution that's currently going on in every way, computers' ability and with the data. So I think perception, as I see it, is kind of catching up. When I see the surge on inequality now, when I've watched it kind of stable for the past 5 years, I say, okay, well, this surge came up. A lot of people write about it. It gets in there. There's a diffusion through the public, and it's starting to hit the public now, crossing with the political realm where you're hitting a couple of elections and things. So there's an instant rise up now that comes up, but part of it, to me, from a measurement perspective, is tied to, it's just new stuff we're seeing.
But I also think it's interesting that the report on business now has the calculator of how long does it take the top CEO to earn your salary, right? So I think there is, I think that there is a perception, at least at that end, that the market outcome is not fair. I would like to see, and I think it's more of a struggle at the bottom end, to see that the market outcome is not fair. And that's where I see we have some struggle. And I also see the struggle. Unfortunately, I guess, see that perception of CEO income similar to some of the perception about public sector workers or about other unionized workers. So the perception isn't how do we get so that everybody has a defined benefit pension plan? The perception is how do we take it away from the people who have it? And that's a bigger dilemma, I think.
Maybe from a different angle, the idea about how you shift perceptions on the idea of people being entitled to market incomes. One reason to think that there has been some shift, and there probably will be more shift, is the more that the public perceives that luck is involved. Again, there's actually in the equality literature, there's actually quite a bit of work being done in the last decade on this idea about luck and the ways in which it impacts perceptions of inequality. But the specific example that I'm thinking about are one of the consequences of certain people, certain university students picking certain job paths, right? So, for example, right now in Ontario, teachers' college graduates. Teachers' college graduates are among getting into teachers' college after your first degree is among the most competitive. For example, at York, it doesn't get a whole lot of publicity. It typically is harder to get into the B.Ed program after a 4-year degree than to get into Osgoode. Right? Even though job placement in Ontario for teachers is about 7%. So in other words, you get really good students who aren't getting jobs. And when parents of those children, so on and so forth, see that, they actually become much more dismayed about the idea that you work hard, you're going to succeed, boom, boom, boom. And those are the kind of things that will, in my view, probably impact changes. Likewise, I mentioned at the beginning some of the Pew Research in the United States. And there's now a lot of evidence in their findings that American views are shifting significantly. I can't remember the exact details about one of their findings, but that something like 67% of Americans, but 70% of Americans 10 years ago perceived market incomes as fair. And that's now dropped down to about 50%. Which is a big transition in a short period of time. But again, it's not exactly your comment, but it suggests, and again, it's not difficult to map that onto some of the phenomena that's occurring.
If I can give you a suggestion, you say you're from Osgoode. I don't know the terms, not lawyer stuff, but I think I was talking with Tom Corshane, and you might find it interesting to look at a split between common law and civil law, and he was really looking at that for the perceptions of how acceptable is the income inequality of that, and looking across countries. I haven't formed it, we haven't seen any hard research on it, but it was we had an extensive chat, but that could be an important distinction for perceptions across countries.
From a purely pragmatic point of view, when you're talking about changing perceptions and having been involved in the Occupy coverage, I remember when the police moved in, and some editors I worked with kept going, what are their demands? They're just in this park talking and they're not making demands. And then when everybody was moved out, both on Wall Street and here in Toronto, there was the feeling like, what a failure. They had the media attention on them. They didn't make demands, and then they just moved away, and it was done. What did they do? But before that movement happened, I would say there was little to no big public discussion about income inequality, particularly at the high end. In fact, in some regions, if you brought that up, you would have been labeled a communist and driven out of town. But after that move, it gradually became acceptable to discuss those kinds of things to the point where the four of us are up here talking about this today. And it's, as some of those statistics showed, it's not just NDP voters, but also PC voters. And I think at the end, that was the big success of that. They didn't demand any policy changes, and none were given. But in the long term, they drove society, or particularly North American society, to discuss income distribution openly in a way that was just not done before. And it actually, in the long term, was quite a dramatic change.
My name is Selena Zhang. I'm from the School of Public Policy and Governance at the U of T, and I'm a research associate at the City of Toronto. And my question is for Mr. Murphy. You showed a lot of interesting statistics, and I have a technical question about the survey of labor and income dynamics. I've seen that in recent years, that and other longitudinal surveys have been discontinued, and so I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what Statistics Canada is doing, or what options or challenges there are to measure and look at the impact of inequality on Canadians. And also, in addition, the mandatory long-form census is also gone now. So if you could speak a little bit about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I assure you that even though we no longer have SLID, that's not reduced our interest in measuring and or putting studies and data out on this. You're right, it is a loss. There are currently I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called LISA. There's a new longitudinal panel survey that's in its second wave now. Part of the criticism of SLID was all about its 6-year time frame. It was too short. We couldn't see the precedents to people's problems or the resolutions after the fact. So what we try and do now, you can go to the Longitudinal Analysis Data Bank. It's a little harder to get access to, but that's the thing where I've got 5 million tax filers from 1982 to 2011 with their full history. So it's incredibly rich, incredible detail. We don't have enough right side variables, but we're imputing them on all the time. So you basically got the LAD, the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank, and then you've got a panel which will gradually come more like the PSID, which will go on in future. So no, we're quite concerned, obviously, but we'll keep producing. And there will be new low-income persistence rates probably within a year, generated from the admin data. So they'll be there.
I'll give a footnote for if you're a U of T student. York U of T had a joint Statistics Canada Research Data Center where that data is available free of charge for any student or faculty. And so if you want access to it, you can get access to it.
Well, not quite the LAD yet, but I'm still working on it. Within 3 years, maybe, in the RDCs.
Is that I saw that
it's in the Federal Research Data Center. I've started a pilot that the LAD, the administrative data, is based on tax data, so it's not yet in the university RDCs.
Sorry,
but I'm trying to get it there, and we've got a pilot in the Federal Research Data Center that's going well, and if that goes well, we're trying to extend it so all university researchers will have access.
Good morning. I'm Junior Higgins from Region of Peel. I just want to find out if there is any research. I'm Junior Higgins from the Region of Peel. I just want to find out if there is any research into how the higher concentration of wealth in a particular category is being used. How is it being used between investment, savings, and consumption? And how would that impact income inequality in the society? And another question, is there an opportunity to promote a cultural shift on the side of consumption in particular, so that more funds are used in a particular area, for example, in service industries, and how would that impact income inequality in the long run? Was my question clear?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just not simple. I'll leave him. I mean, I think there is evidence, and the dead money conversation, or the dead money conversation, is that increasing concentration in corporate Canada is actually being sat on as opposed to invested in productive investments. I think one of the concerns about increased inequality, and one of the uses of it that I don't think we've talked about here, is political influence. And so you see the example of the Koch, I don't know that I ever said that out loud, the Koch brothers in the U.S., who put massive amounts of money into political lobbying for policy changes that will in fact increase their fortunes. And I think we see some of that in Canada as well. So that's, I think, one of the least productive uses of that money, or one of the uses that has the most negative impact on inequality. I guess my solution, I think my policy solution would be to step back from the uses of that increased concentration of income and wealth, redirecting that concentration to seeing what are the ways in which we could reduce the concentration rather than redirect it after the fact.
Yeah. I mean, in part, you can see the use of wealth in the take-up of tax expenditures. So finance is constantly producing these tables on the take-up of tax expenditures. I guess some of them are a little unfortunate. We've seen I think 100% of the stock deduction credit, the tax expenditure value of stock deduction goes to the top 1%. I think 100% fully, all taken up. Whereas others tend to be capital expenditures. So what you're seeing is you put the incentives for capital to find its way into certain investments that you give it a tax credit for. And people follow them all the time. And you put a tax credit and it fills up because, again, you've got this series of accountants and people that know how to move money around so you can minimize your taxes owing.
Hello. Hi. My name is Dina Warmin. I'm a Policy Development Officer at the City of Toronto in Social Development, Finance and Administration. I'm actually working on the Jobs Quality Assessment Tool as well as a Poverty Reduction Framework. So if anybody's interested, I would love to talk with you. You feel free to talk with me afterwards. I have two questions, and it builds on what you were just speaking of. One is, and I might be making a wrong assumption, but if so much of our income is going to the top 1%, and the top 1% are very savvy at avoiding taxation, then why aren't we reconsidering how we do our taxation policy? And I know the idea of flat tax or simplified taxation is some, conservative versus liberal versus NDP, or Republican versus Democrat. But realistically, if we simplify our taxation policy, wouldn't we actually recoup more of that taxation overall? So wouldn't that be better? So that's question one. Question two is that we understand that our industries have completely changed. We are no longer a manufacturing industry. We are a service industry. And it seems to me that somehow during the Industrial Revolution, we created a middle class out of manufacturing. How or if can we create a middle class out of the service industry?
So the flat tax question, I'm going to leave to Brian maybe.
The number guy.
In terms of how you would increase revenues. I mean, I think one of the pieces about progressivity or about high income earners is it's important to to, it's important as a demonstration effect, as a fairness effect, to kind of encourage everybody to pay their taxes, to say that you are in fact going to have a progressive system where you are kind of based on ability to pay. So I think that's one important piece. I think the other important piece of that is that while high income earners have an increasing share of income, there's still a lot of people and a lot of different tax bases that we need to use to collect income. But I can't really answer your question about what are the relative revenues available from a flat tax versus a progressive tax. I think your question about how do we turn bad jobs into good jobs is a really relevant one. And I think one of the ways that we do that is we do that through government regulation. And one of those government regulations is modernizing the Labor Relations Act, so that, because in terms of those jobs in mining and in terms of those jobs in manufacturing, those jobs weren't good jobs because they started out that way. It was a combination of the impact of unionization that really had an impact on those jobs. And so now we still have a Labor Relations Act that the model is kind of Stelco when it had 15,000 workers as opposed to when it had, I heard the other day, 600 workers, versus Tim Hortons where you have, I don't know, maybe 120 workers in many, many locations. I won't make a Doug Ford mistake to say there are more than in libraries, but there's so the idea of how the legislation is structured really has to change with the structure of the economy. And I think that's really the crucial question, is how do we shift those jobs into better jobs?
And there are definitely legislative issues there. There are a lot of practical issues as well. Unfortunately, a lot of service industry jobs tend to be in businesses that are lower margin. So when you said, when you had a line worker at GM who was putting in on a $30,000 car saying, I want a bigger share of that, the business model could handle that and sustain it. With retail, with a lot of restaurant work, the margins are a lot more narrow. Now you can say, well, McDonald's makes an awful lot of money. Certainly they do, but on a franchise level, it's tougher to work in those big price increases, and to put some of the blame on ourselves when we go out shopping at stores demanding the lowest price, that means that their workers aren't going to be making a lot of money either. So we kind of have to ask ourselves, are we willing to pay for some better service industry jobs as well?
Just to add to that, though, there's actually been some really interesting and exciting research. Costco, Trader Joe's, these are low-cost alternatives.
Yep.
QuickTime is an example in the States where it's like cheap.
Certainly.
And their corporate leadership is maybe the model that we want to
and Costco is a perfect example where you would see them competing with a Walmart, but they pay more, they have great benefits, and they say actually it costs them less because there's less employee turnover, less training, less loss, less employee theft at stores and whatnot. And you should read the Toronto Star in July when we're doing a wonderful series on how to make working better, where we're talking to some of those companies.
I can just address your question. I can tell you first, you can solve it yourself. You phone up StatCan, get the social policy simulation database and model, and you'd be happy to simulate a flat tax system, a progressive system, whatever you want. But it is a question. You can play with it. It's a hard question because the tax system, of course, isn't just about vertical equity. It's about horizontal equity. It's about revenue neutrality, and above all, revenue generation. So those are the trade-offs that are getting you. You can't just attack the vertical equity side. And I just wanted to conclude by letting you know the taxes paid by the high end aren't necessarily lower. Those effective marginal tax rates go up at every level, and they go up into the 40s. What you do see, however, is a much larger range of effective tax rates in the very high zones. Why? Because those are the ones that are able to use these deductions for capital, et cetera. So you might get people down, they'll lower their tax rate to 10%, but there's others up at 40%, above 40. And if you look at doctors, for the same amount of money, they pay more than lawyers. And lawyers pay more than accountants. So it's how you're using the system on those things.
Hi, my name is Amin Milani. I'm an associate professor of tax at Shoe Lake at York. You mentioned that 100% of that stock option deduction goes to the top 1%. Why cannot we target and remove that? It seems that labor income is being taxed like capital income. That was one question. The other question is we have to question about capital being more mobile than labor. The McDonald's franchise that was found guilty of some temporary foreign workers violations was actually independently owned franchise, not a corporate franchise. That franchisor is even less mobile than the employee. A Torontonian cannot own a franchise in Red Deer. So yet we take the assumption that capital is more mobile than labor. A lot of our capital is not as mobile and could be taxed a little higher rate, especially in these temporary foreign workers things. If it was corporate franchises, it might be different. But individual franchises have to be there at the curb at the real estate.
So in terms of stock, it was just in terms of stock options. The employee of the Government of Canada measures things. He whispered to me. But yeah, that was I think that's a very interesting perception to talk about how to kind of clarify how we think about the mobility of capital. Thank you.
Please do.
I'll go to the mic. We know that countries with a flatter gradient for income, so less inequality, have better outcomes for the general population. So income outcomes are obviously better, health outcomes are better, education outcomes are better, and that's been the case for quite a while. One of the areas of consensus there seems to be about remedies for inequality in general is investing in things like health and education. I was listening to Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, on CBC last week, I guess, and that was one of the things that she mentioned. So it does seem to be an area of consensus. What I'm wondering is, could all three of you comment on what you see as the dynamic? Is it a purely technical thing? They have those economies are more distributive in many ways, and they're able to generate more public income to actually put into those services. Do those economies not care about the debt and the deficit, and they're just, England is a case actually, which has a much greater debt and deficit than we do, and much more tolerance for that. I'm not sure their public services are any better than ours, but so what is the dynamic between the flatter gradient and the improved outcomes? It may sound like the village idiot question.
No. That's very good.
I mean, I could start if you want. The sort of pioneer person doing work on that was Richard Wilkinson. And Wilkinson's straightforward answer, which strikes me as right, is that those policies have the effect of promoting inclusion. So that the point being that societies with greater income inequalities are also characterized by less homogeneity around, or a sense of people being all in this together. And that the greater sense that you have this sense of all being in this all together is more likely to perpetuate policies that sustain less inequality. And so, those dynamics, some people have said, for example, that have tried to link it to things like immigrant societies like Canada and the United States are less likely to be inclusive because but in fact, most of the evidence from, for example, Nordic countries is that they haven't been impacted by immigration. So it's not actually, that's a misperception that the Wilkinson kind of findings suggest. No, it's the policies that drives the inclusion and the commitment to inclusion, and subsequently the perceptions of unfairness. Again, it made part of the inference about the post-2008 polls, not just in Canada but elsewhere, that somehow income inequality has hit some kind of tipping point where large numbers of people are perceiving it as unfair, and that that actually is something new that may well generate greater inclusive policies.
I mean, Wilkinson is now, I mean, there's a kind of pretty big debate about Wilkinson and Wilkinson's results at this. It's when social epidemiologists try and go too far, I think. But I think that I really think it kind of comes back to what the fellow over there was talking about, of what do you see as the role of market outcomes, right? And do you actually think, where do you see the role of government, and where do you see the role of government in both producing outputs like education and healthcare, and that kind of mixed role, and that's I think one of the kind of crucial differences there. And in terms of the health, I mean, you know, there are a number of health outcomes that you can kind of trace back through a number of pathways that say you have better health outcomes, and when you have better health outcomes, you have a better life chances. But I think it's really about your views on how mixed your economy should be, and that kind of leads you all down that road.
When I look at some of the inter-country comparisons, we have to characterize people. It's quite stock, sort of at a point in time. Sweden, and you know, we all think of Sweden. You look at that, but their taxation used to be much higher, 95% of income. Nothing's plummeted down. So while it may look flatter now, I think I like to try and think of where are they in a growth or stasis phase, and all these things are changing. And in fact, income inequality is always going to start off pretty well by a lead in. Someone gets richer, someone gets some more resources. It makes a difference in the community, and the others catch up in there. So there's always a stasis versus where they are in the change. And the European countries are older. Take a look at our wing of the Anglo-Saxon stuff. It's pretty new. Come across here and look in there. They've got other influences. So I think there's a balance. We follow each other. Is flatter better? I think, again, it's to me, I have to go down to the more specific policies at time and place for those countries to move them.
Last call?
Whoa.
I'm always up for last call. This is actually more of a comment to everyone and an encouragement to have a look at an organization that I'm involved with, which is called Canadians for Tax Fairness. We are a completely volunteer organization that does advocacy around tax policy. Woohoo, so fun! But, you know, it's important, as we've heard today, the kinds of levers and mechanisms that all levels of government can use in order to reduce income inequality and make society more fair. So have a look at our website, Canadians for Tax Fairness. I think it's taxfairness.ca, but I might be wrong. And we've got some folks in Ottawa who are doing advocacy work, you know, who go to standing committees of the House and the Senate and talk about these issues in great detail, but also produce interesting infographics that can be circulated on social media. And so thanks for that. Just thought I'd give a plug. Thank you.
Okay, Jeff Stutz is going to wrap up.
We've been on a remarkable learning journey this morning, and I'm pleased to tell you that the presentations will be on the IPAC website, as well as a video recording which will capture the excellent questions and discussion. For me, this has been amazing. I want to thank Brian for giving us the grounding in the facts, which are so important. Sheila did it as well on the policy level. I think showing us that we have the tools to make significant change. Already tools that are being used, but much greater scope to do this going forward, which I think Leslie underlined as well, that Canadians are ready to see governments taking action in this field, that there's a lot of scope for development. I enjoyed Doug's questions, his probing and pressing the issues so that we could see a lot of different sides of the issues. Now we will be, as Julie mentioned, presenting certificates to the panelists for donation that IPAC will make on their behalf to the Lieutenant Governor's Aboriginal Literacy campaign. I'd like to say that we'll be continuing this dialogue with at least 2 more sessions in the fall. On October 15th, we'll have a session on capitalism and good jobs, which will, I think, continue some of the issues that we've talked about here regarding the opportunities for youth, the impact of education, and unionization. We have some excellent speakers, and all of you will receive information about that. A little later in the fall, we will have a session on the implications of slow growth for public services in this economic environment. And then we'll reassess and perhaps may continue the process because certainly there are more aspects to the issue and I think a real appetite to probe into it and see governments take action. Now, I want to also say that we'll be sending you a survey on your experience this morning, and that is a very important tool for us at Institute of Public Administration to deliver good programs to you and take your ideas into account for the content and the approach that we'll use in the future. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope to see you again at future events, and thanks so much to our panelists.